So now I'm back to the neck. And what I'm doing here is I'm using 2-part epoxy to glue in the mother of pearl fret marker dots. I'll use an 18-inch long, 10-inch radius sanding block to flush sand those marker dots with the fretboard. I'm also using this time to make sure that the radius is perfectly formed from nut to heel and from side to side. Now for this particular neck, I'm just going to use a very simple hand-rubbed finish consisting of boiled linseed oil. I'll rub this on the entire guitar neck, and then I'll wipe it down with some mineral spirits to help the boiled linseed oil penetrate the wood better. Since I don't want to burn down my shop, any of the rags that I used I'll lay out on the floor of my shop and let them dry before I dispose of them later on. I'll let the oil soak into the wood for about 30 minutes, and then I'll come back out and wipe off the excess. Then it will be allowed to sit for a couple of days for the oil to dry. So it's back to the body. Because I used the black artist oil to help pop the grain, I want to go back in and do some sanding in a few areas just to make sure that the appearance of the grain is consistent. For the top of the guitar, I applied blue artist oil paint straight from the tube and covered the entire surface. Then I took a rag with a little bit of Japan dryer on it and rubbed it in to give it that transparent look and to help speed up the drying. Because the artist oil paints take a long time to dry, I have a little bit of time to kind of work with the finish to get exactly the look that I want. The body and the neck will hang up in the shop for a couple of days until the finish is completely dry and cured. I decided to go ahead and add the blue artist oil color to the back and sides of the guitar, and because of the natural color of the mahogany, it has a really cool multicolor effect. And then after 12 hours it was dry to a touch, but it still needs to cure. While the oil stain is curing on the body, I'm going to go ahead and install the frets. And the first step is to radius the fret wire so it precisely matches the radius of the fretboard. I'm using stainless steel frets, and I know a lot of guys don't like to use stainless steel frets because of how much work it takes to get the frets level, crowned, polished, all that, plus the amount of wear and tear it puts on your tools. But I have found that as long as the fretboard is very precisely radiused and the fret wire matches that radius, once the wire has been installed, there's a good chance I'm going to have very minimal amount of leveling work to do later on. The fret slots on my fretboard stop just short of the edge of the fretboard, so for that reason I need to nip the tangs on each end of each fret wire. I use a simple homemade jig to clamp the fret wire with the tang facing up, and then I use a file just to file off the ends of that tang on the fret wire. And of course, I'll nip the tang on each end of each fret wire. To prepare for pressing in the frets, I just press one end of the tang into the slot. I use a half-ton arbor press with a fret pressing caul to make quick work of installing the frets. As added insurance, I like to make sure the frets will stay seated by adding a drop of CA glue to each end. To do this, I'll clamp the fret down with my arbor press, and then I'll apply a drop of CA glue to each end of the fret wire using my special little applicator. Capillary action will draw the CA glue into the slot so that once it dries, it holds the fret firmly in place. After installing the frets, I beveled the ends. Now I can install some side marker dots. I'm going to be using some white plastic rod, so I'll drill the correct size hole just by eyeballing the position. I'll add a drop of CA glue accelerator into each hole. Then I'll take the plastic rod and I'll dip it into some CA glue, which I've poured into a plastic cap. Then I'll place the rod into the hole, it dries instantly, and then I can clip it off flush with the fretboard. I'll lightly sand the marker dots flush with the fretboard using some 400 grit sandpaper. Then I'll wipe on a smear of some boiled linseed oil to seal the edge of the fretboard where I installed the marker dots. There's still a lot of fretwork to do, but the neck is far enough along that I can install it into the body. However, I need to finish the body first. Now here I've made the covers for the control cavity, the tremolo cavity, and I also made a little name badge which I will install with epoxy into the back of the guitar, as you see right here. Now this guitar is going to get a high gloss clear coat, but before I can do that, I need to prep the surface by applying a sanding sealer and some grain filler. This is going to be my spray booth. This is just a simple dollar store drop sheet which I've hung up in the corner of my shop. I'm going to be using Crystal Lax water-based sanding sealer, which I'll spray using my low volume, low pressure spray system. One of the reasons why I like to use a water-based product like Crystal Lac and a low volume, low pressure spray system is I don't need to use an elaborate spray booth or ventilation system. However, I still will wear a paint respirator. After this first coat of sanding sealer has dried, and it'll take about an hour, I'll very lightly sand the surface with some 400 grit sandpaper and then apply a second coat just to make sure I have complete coverage. Then I'll be ready to move on to the next step, which will be to fill the grain. A good alternative to sandpaper is to use a synthetic Scotch-Brite pad like I'm using here to scuff the surface. You cannot, however, use traditional steel wool because steel wool will leave behind tiny little particles, and if you don't get all those particles cleaned off, when you spray a water-based finish over the top of them, they'll rust and ruin your finish. The purpose of the sealer at this stage is to provide a barrier between the stain that I applied earlier and the grain filler, which I'm about to apply next. I'll be using Crystal Lac's water-based wood grain filler on this guitar to fill in all the grain. As you can see here, it's kind of a milky white color to it, but once it dries, it will dry crystal clear. And the other nice thing is you can add color tints to it if you want to. Now I find the easiest way to apply this is just to rub it in with my fingers. It's non-toxic, but I still wear gloves just because it makes cleanup a little bit easier later on. You can also trowel it on and trowel it off if you want to. But I find that because my guitars typically have a lot of contour shaping and curves, it's just easier to wipe it on with my fingers and then rub it into the grain and wipe off any excess and distribute it evenly. Troweling it isn't necessarily as effective. Now I'll apply this wood grain filler to the front, back, and sides. I'll let it dry for a couple of hours, and then I'll apply a second coat. I'll probably apply a third coat to the front because it's ash, which has more of an open grain. After the wood grain filler had dried, I went back and scuff sanded the surface with 220 grit sandpaper. I'm not trying to level sand at this point because if I did that, there's a chance I would sand through and take some of the blue stain off. This is what the surface looks like after sanding. The grain is getting pretty nicely filled at this point. Before I can spray my final top coats, I need to have a surface that's perfectly smooth. And because I use the wood grain filler, the surface is not quite there yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spray some of the Crystal Lac sanding sealer down, and I'll probably put 3 or 4 coats, and then I'll level sand those smooth before I start to spray my final top coats.